Okay, assalamu alaikum to everyone who's on right now. Inshallah, we'll give people a little bit more time to get on, maybe 3 or 4 minutes, and then we can get started, inshallah. Jazakallah, assalamu alaikum. Okay, assalamu alaikum, everyone. Inshallah, we can go ahead and get started. People can join in as we go. So today, inshallah, the topic will be 10 spiritual principles for activism. And our speaker will be Brother Saad Omar. I'm sure some of you guys have seen or heard him speak before, so I guess that is it, and I can pass it off to you, Brother Saad. Assalamu alaikum.
Assalamu alaikum everyone. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. إن الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستهديه ونستغفر ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا من سيئات أعمالنا من يهد الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد And when we hear the Prophet Prophet's name, we all say Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. Brother Numan, someone can confirm if you guys can hear me clearly? Can you quote with the mic? Okay, wonderful. My internet can be a little wacky sometimes, so if we cut off, it should come right back on. So if you guys just wait for a minute, it'll come back on, inshallah. This is a presentation I did earlier this summer for another group of activists, and I also just shared it with the Ohio State University MSA about 2 days ago. The world we're in right now, there's a lot of change. For some people, there's a lot of fear. I want to start off by saying that we are living in one of the best times to be Muslim. And I don't mean that in a cliche way. This is a true statement. The Prophet ﷺ taught us that the people who became Muslim before the Hijrah are not like the ones who became Muslim after. And the people who became Muslim before Badr are not like those after. Before Uhud are not like those after. The people who became Muslim before the conquest of Mecca are not like those who became Muslim after. So there's something special about those early companions. The people who were willing to hold their fort, that were willing to hold the flag of the deen when things were the most difficult, when the persecution was the most intense. And for a vast majority of our history, when Muslims were in the so-called golden age, right? And we have to be very clear, we never say the golden age of Islam, because Islam is beyond time. So there's no golden age of Islam. But there have been times where Muslims were in a position of political strength or cultural, or from a knowledge perspective, they were in a golden age. But in those times, there may not have been the same level of tribulation that we face today. So in a way, it's kind of a very beautiful thing that Muslims today have the opportunity to be early companions again. I want to just pause for a second and I want us to reflect on that. That right now we have the opportunity to be Meccan Muslims. And I don't know about you, but right, I would rather be a Meccan Muslim than a Muslim in the later phases. And so there's something very beautiful about tribulation and trial. Okay, so we're going to pause for a second and we're going to go through the presentation. If there's any issues with the internet, I'm going to ask Brother Noman to give me a call, and that way I'll know to pause and allow the internet to reconnect, inshallah. And we can just be patient with that. Or we can type it if there's a disconnection with the internet. So we're going to be going through the presentation. The first slide is showing up as NS, but it's actually Foundations. And it is titled 10 Spiritual Principles of Dissent. Okay, so what are the principles internally that we have to have if we want to be activists, if we want to fight the good fight, if we want to change the world? And this is very important that we are talking about a spiritual, or you could use the term religious principles of activism. In our deen, we don't have two groups. And listen to this very carefully. We don't have one group, and I was talking to Ohio State about this, that a lot of our MSAs, a lot of the young activists, there are two groups that are forming. You have the groups of the activists, and they're kind of going to rallies and doing political work and all of that. And then you have the group of people who go to MSA and they're more into halaqas and learning, right? Recently, what's happened is because of the activism in the Muslim community and the way it's gone, is that those two groups are starting to mix, where the same people who are very involved in the masjid and halakas are starting to get more involved with activism. But for a long time, I had friends, and the friends that were a little more politically active, they were a little less involved, or a lot less involved in religious or other forms of religious activities, like going to the mosque and halakas and activism in that way. And the friends that were a little more spiritual, the activists saw them as very passive. So they were praying, they were reading Quran, they were fasting, but they didn't see them in the trenches. And in our deen, we don't have a divide. So if we see Surah Ma'un, أَرَيْتَ الَّذِي يُكَذِّبُ بِالدِّينِ, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling us about the people who have rejected the deen, they've rejected the day of judgment. This is a very, very strong statement. أَرَيْتَ الَّذِي يُكَذِّبُ بِالدِّينِ, have you seen the one who rejects the day of judgment, that rejects the deen itself? فَذَلِكَ الَّذِي يَدُعُّ الْيَتِيمَ وَلَا يَهُدُّ وَلَا طَعَامَ الْمِسْكِينِ, that they ignore the orphans, they don't feed the poor. So activism and belief in God are actually connected. Okay, so this is the first point I want everyone to internalize, that the vertical realm and the horizontal realm are connected. So if we are not connected to people, if we're not connected to justice, if we're not connected to serving, to being out there, to being active, it's not just that, oh, I'm not an activist, that's not my thing. It actually reveals that there's something wrong with that vertical connection between us and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. How can someone truly believe in God and not care for the servants of God? How can someone truly believe in the Prophet ﷺ and not want to go into the battles for truth like the Prophet ﷺ did? We know the story of Ka'b radiallahu anhu, and there are other stories like this in the Seerah where there was a battle and people were going out to battle, and a few of the companions stayed back in Medina. And this companion specifically, he actually had the intention of going out. And he delayed, he procrastinated, and the army left. So he didn't decide he wasn't going to join the activists. He wasn't going to join the people of truth. He was just going to stay at home. But he ended up missing the caravan. He missed the army. And Ansa Tamara Gray was talking about this, that this was a sin of procrastination. This was a sin of not joining the ranks of the truthful and the believers when they were going to do something good. And for days, for weeks, the companions had to wait until Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala himself sent down verses in the Quran forgiving these companions. So there isn't, and this is the first point I want to make, there isn't a Muslim who is an activist Muslim and a Muslim who is a spiritual Muslim. And there are two different groups. And unfortunately, these days we're starting to see that. Now, you could be someone that's a little more inclined towards one or the other. That's okay. But you can't categorically say, I am more spiritual, I don't do activism, I'm an activist. How many times has it happened that we're organizing an event and we miss praying? We're so busy with the conference that we don't actually pray. I've seen this in a lot of the youth organizations as someone who has spoken at these institutions for a very long time, and I actually grew up in Mina also. Oftentimes, the leaders of these institutions, the one organizing the camp, the one organizing the conference, the national executive director, or whatever, are not in any of the lectures. They're actually having meetings during the speeches. So this is where you start seeing imbalance, where activism starts replacing your personal development, right? And this is probably one of the reasons that this personal development forum exists in Mina, that we have to have balance between activism and personal spirituality, okay? And because we have a lot of labels in our community, Sufi and all these labels, we start thinking that you can have one group that's all about one or all about the other. This is a deen of balance. So before I continue, I'm going to make sure that we understand this point. So does everyone get where we're coming from? Does everyone understand why we have this presentation that is bringing together the internal and the external? So you can respond in the chat and we'll move on. Yes, we got it. So we need body and spirit. Okay, we need external and internal. We need to be in one of the righteous people, he said about the companions of the Prophet ﷺ, and you can write this down. This is kind of a cool quote. He said, at night they were like monks. During the day they were like knights, like Knights. So if someone can write that down in the chats as a quote, that the companions at night were like monks, and during the day they were like knights. Right? So we'll wait for someone. Huda can write that down, inshallah, and then we'll move on. So we need to have both. So these are the 10 spiritual principles of descent. These are 10 principles that I've come up with that I think if we embody that, we will have that balance, inshallah. Okay, let's move on. First principle, expel falsehood and affirm truth. Now, some of you will see this, that the image below is the Shahada, right? We have the beginning, the La ilaha illallah, and then below that, Muhammad Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Now, here, I'm going to make a very specific point, then we're going to move, because for sake of time, this is usually about an hour and a half, and maybe sometime we'll have the chance to go through this in detail, where what I do when I teach this normally is I have you guys try to figure out each of these points. But each of these points is bringing together the spirituality of activism to create harmony, right? So in the Shahada, we have this principle of exhaling before inhaling, right? We have this principle that first we must expel all falsehood before we can inhale truth. So you first say La ilaha, there is no God. So you're exhaling all the false gods. And then you internalize illallah, except Allah. And you inhale pure tawheed. Okay, so I'm going to move locations really quick. So you first have to exhale, then you can inhale. And this becomes a principle of activism. How does it become a principle of activism? That first, the activists, before they can fill their life with good, they have to exhale all falsehood from themselves. And this will come out later. This idea, Gandhi said, be the change you want to see in the world. It comes very closely from the idea in our deen that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will not change the situation of a people until they change what's in themselves. Now here's something very important. One of the sisters in our community gave a beautiful talk, Sister Amanda, and she was talking about, I recently moved to Ohio, and she was talking about that the idea of our deen is that we should be overfilling like cups of, like if you have a cup, you overfill it with a drink, and then that liquid will overflow into the community. But if our hearts are not full, it is very hard for us to give to others. Now, someone would say, okay, but if it's like religious knowledge, yeah, you have to have a connection with your deen before you can teach. And it doesn't mean you have to be perfect. Otherwise, we'll spend our whole life just developing ourselves and never giving to people. But there has to be something inside for us to give. But that also exists for political activism, for social activism. Because in the end of the day, there is no political activism. There's no, all activism is religious activism. A Muslim can be working for social issues or cultural issues or whatever, but they're working for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So all issues of activism are issues of the religion. They're issues that require personal development. Now, the other principle that can come from this, though, of expelling falsehood before affirming truth, is this is the first point has to do with the activists themselves. We have to first work on ourselves, expel all the envy and jealousy that can later come and disrupt our work, okay, and can destroy us. There are people who save others, but they themselves are not saved. And we were actually taught by the Prophet ﷺ these categories of people. That there are people who help others and they help themselves. There are people who hurt other people and they hurt themselves. But there are also a lot of activists. They try to save the world, but they don't take care of themselves. But another way that this could be applied, this principle of expelling falsehood and affirming truth. And once again, it's inspired by the Shahada itself. La ilaha then illallah. Is that when we're trying to change the world, when we're trying to change our communities, we have to first look at the false systems and foundations before we just try to build bigger and better things. So I'll give an analogy to explain that. If you have an old house, okay, and you're buying it and you want to live or sell this house, and you go in and you see that the plumbing is totally messed up and the electricity is totally messed up. If you go in and just give it a makeover, you paint it up, you add new lights, you add new furniture, you even add new carpet and flooring, but you don't actually gut out the electricity and the plumbing and fix it, then are you actually fixing the house? You're not. If you're selling it, you're just fooling people. And a lot of times in our activism, what we're doing is we're giving makeovers. It's like extreme makeover Muslim edition. We're not actually fixing the systematic problems of our community. So sometimes when we're talking about, like, for example, with our mosques, we have to ask deep questions. Why is it that a lot of converts don't feel comfortable in the mosque? Or a lot of times sisters don't feel comfortable? Or young people don't feel comfortable? People of other faiths. So the idea is not to just create bigger and better mosques from a quantity perspective, but it is first to look at the false foundations that we've built our institutions and fix those and then continue to build. So the principle is we have to be building on strong foundations. So if the foundation of politics in a country is totally corrupt, it doesn't matter too much which elected official comes into that system. So as a community, at a micro level, at a macro level, we have to look at the institutional problems. It's not enough to become a doctor. Some of us need to go into medicine. Some of us need to work in trying to fix the systematic problems of the healthcare system, right? So we have to expel falsehood, fix that foundation, and then build on that. So that's a principle of activism and is taught to us by the Shahada. It comes from our deepest religious spiritual roots. La ilaha. You expel the false gods. Illallah. You inhale pure Tawheed. Point number 2. This point is path is not the destination. Means are not the ends. And as I mentioned, because this is such a short halaqah, I won't be able to do what I normally do, where I ask you all to try to figure out. It's kind of like a riddle, where you have to figure out the principle before we talk about it. But as we're going through these slides, try to figure out on your own what you think this means. So the first line is, path is not the destination. Means are not the ends. Okay. For the sake of brevity and to keep this kind of flowing, I'll share what I think, but also reflect on your own how you interpret it. One of the meanings of path is not the destination. When I wrote that, what I was thinking of is sometimes we confuse the path with the goal. So, for example, the path is Islam. Islam is the means to God. Islam is not the destination itself. The goal as a Muslim is not to make Islam really big. Sometimes we get too focused on the Islam thing, which is taking us to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It's like we say stuff like, oh, we're the fastest growing religion in the world, and Islam is this and Islam is that. It's almost like Islam becomes the team that we want to fight for. It becomes like the team that we want to play for. As one of our scholars, Sheikh Hamza Yusuf, said, I didn't convert to Islam to join Beni Islam, like a tribe. And it's like my tribe against your tribe. Islam is the path to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The point is not Islam. The point is Allah Himself. And Islam as a lifestyle is taking us to God. We have to spend more time thinking about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and not getting lost in the religion itself. In that, it's not that the religion is not important, but the religion sometimes can become like a club that we want to live in. It can become a way of distinguishing ourselves from others, but in a way that makes us it's like a feel-good thing where we want to seem like we're better than other people. It can become like a country club that we think others can't enter into. So we have to be very, very careful of when Islam as a path to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala becomes Islamism. I'll write this down. Islam versus Islamism. It becomes just a body of ideas, a worldly thing. Like you have capitalism, you have communism, and now you have Islamism. It's just a group of people who think they're right, but the spiritual dimension is God. Activism becomes a worldly thing. And we have to ask ourselves some very difficult questions. I was involved with Minna and I was in part of all the different levels of Minna. And I remember there was a time I asked myself, am I in Minna for God? Or am I in Minna only for a social group? Am I in Minna because I enjoy the camps and I can now travel to California and I came from a small town in Indiana where that wasn't possible? Is this Minna thing bringing me to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Or is it just making me proud of my identity? Identity is fine, but an over obsession with identity keeps Islam from allowing us to fly to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So the path is not the destination, but here's the other point. Means are not the ends. Means are not the ends. You know, Malcolm X had that quote, by any means necessary. And we love Malcolm X. But we don't take every one of his ideas without criticism, without critical analysis. And Malcolm himself was changing as he progressed and matured, especially after Hajj, right? So this idea of by any means necessary is not from our deen. And we have to be and Malcolm is my favorite person in the world. You know, on my back wall, if you look at that wall back there, I actually have the original newspaper from the day Malcolm X was killed. He's one of my biggest inspirations. But we are people that do not believe that by any means necessary we will bring change. We are people of means. The way we do it is actually more important than the result, because that's what we can control. That's what we can choose, right? So when we're talking about getting to a certain goal, we have to make sure. I'll give one practical point from this. If we are organizing a conference, the goal is not just having a successful conference. The goal is that everyone is respected along the way. And how often as activists can we be rude to the people around us because we think that the end goal is more important than the means? We can say, hey guys, come on, you guys are late, and we're really rude people sometimes because we're trying to get a certain result. And we have to realize that actually the way we get there is more important than where we're going. The way we get there is actually what we're judged by. Okay, so we're going to move on, inshallah. Number 3. And like I said, if we have more time someday, we'll go through this in greater detail. Okay, horizontal rebellion must be rooted in vertical conformity. Horizontal rebellion must be rooted in vertical conformity. Okay, I'll just give you guys a second to think about what this means. And what we'll probably do today, just for sake of time, is we'll go through the first 5 slides today, and then the next 5 slides if we ever do this again, inshallah, down the road. Horizontal rebellion must be rooted in vertical conformity. So if we are nonconformists, we are not nonconformists for the sake of being nonconformists. The goal is not just being like some hip outlaw. Like, oh, I love just being different and rebellious. Right? It's not like a subculture. We just, every time there's something going on in the world, we want to be on the opposite side of it. We have to make sure that our activism, our dissent, our rebellion, our revolution is based on connection to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the principles. To give you an example, in heaven, there was an act of nonconformity, right? Rebellion. When Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala ordered the angels to bow down to Adam and Iblis from the jinn was there, all of the angels conformed. Satan, Iblis, did not conform. He refused to bow. So in this case, conformity was moral and non-conformity was immoral. So we have to ask ourselves, if we're these rebellious activists, and maybe we're not always rebellious, but we're kind of countering society. Are we rooted in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's law? Are we rooted in a connection to God? Because sometimes what can happen is you can have a dictator, right? You can have a dictator, and we have some terrible dictators right now in the world. We have dictators in so-called Western democratic countries, and we have dictators in places like Syria and Egypt. Horrible dictators. We have to make sure that if we're going to be opposing these dictators, that we are doing it in a way that is in concurrence with our deen and the principles of our deen. And inshallah, the people are. What happens oftentimes is, the victims will become the oppressors once they have power. Without going into details, you can think of a different example to this. You'll have a group of people that was oppressed, and 50 years later, 100 years later, 200 years later, that same group is oppressing the people who were oppressing them. I have friends that when they were talking to me about Palestine and what they would do to Jews if we conquered Palestine again, they were talking about it in a way that made me realize it would be better for us to not have Palestine back right now, because they were talking about it in a way that they would have become the oppressors. Where the Prophet ﷺ, when he entered Mecca, he entered humble. And when people said today is a day of vengeance and blood, the Prophet ﷺ said, no, today is a day of mercy and forgiveness. So this was a person who was opposing the Quraysh, but he didn't lose his principles during his activism. Or like Imam Ali radiallahu anhu, that in the midst of battle, he is in the heat of battle. Dust is swirling, there's blood, there's screaming, there's all of this is happening. And a man spits on him while he's about to kill this man. And he leaves him. Because in that moment he realized that his righteous anger had turned to personal anger. So even in the heat of activism, he did not lose his vertical anchoring. So if you think of a boat that anchors to the ground, believers, our sails are anchored to heaven. It's like an umbilical cord where the baby receives all their sustenance from heaven. Our umbilical cord is to heaven. And the only way that we're going to survive in the trenches of activism these days is like World War I. You're fighting in the trenches and you feel like you work for 2 years and you only gain a few inches. The only way we're going to survive is if we have a strong anchoring to heaven, and if we are always asking ourselves, is this activism for the sake of activism or activism for a higher purpose? And are we, listen to this carefully, are we holding ourselves to the same standard that we expect from the world? Or do we have a code that we expect from the world and we expect much less from ourselves? One of our greatest teachers, he said, and I'll write this down below, I'll type this out. His name is Sheikh Abdul Hakim Murad. His English name is T.J. Winter. He's a professor at Cambridge. He said, activism will only succeed when we remember that history is in good hands. So I'm typing it as I'm saying it, so you can read it below. Activism will only succeed when we remember that history is in good hands. Activism will only succeed when we remember that God exists. That we are not alone in this world, and we are not the ones that are going to single-handedly bring about change. At the end of the day, we are vessels of God, and He does not need us to change the world. Like Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reminds the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam in Surah Shu'ara, which is in the beginning of Surah 26. لَعَلَّكَ بَاخِعٌ نَفْسَكَ أَلَّا يَكُونُوا مُؤْمِنِينَ. It may be that you kill yourself with anxiety, but your people will not believe. إِنَّ شَأْنُ نَزِّلَ عَلَيْهِم مِّنَ السَّمَاءِ آيَةً. If we had wanted, we would have sent down a sign from heaven. And it goes on to say, and then they would have believed. Meaning that I don't need you to convert your people to the deen. This could have happened without you. So when we remember that Allah is truly in control, our activism never becomes desperate because we're not trying to play God. We're just doing our part. Okay? Next slide. And actually, for the sake of time and discussion, I know we started late, but I still want to end on time. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go through these next two slides a little quickly, and then we'll have time for questions. The same teacher that wrote that quote I said below, I'll type his name out. His name is T.J. Winter. I'm writing this out because the halakha is fine. It's really what happens after the halakha that's more important. So this 30-minute halakha, I wanted to spur some ideas, and then you can research on your own. I'm also going to write my email address. If anybody has any questions, comments, or they want further readings, or they want to talk more about what we talked about today, we can discuss it. But this quote is, the profane see the windmill, the saints see the wind. The profane see the windmill, the saints see the wind. And it's very simple. Look at the picture of the tree. If you see a tree blowing, someone may say, oh, the tree is waving at me. Someone who studies science will say, no, the wind is blowing the tree. The person of God will say, no, the wind is blowing the tree using, God is blowing the tree using the wind. So when we see a branch blowing, we not only see the wind, even though we're not seeing the wind, we're seeing the effects of the wind. We see Allah's hand in that action. Imam Ali radiallahu anhu said, I don't see anything, but I see Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in it, before it, and after. And he doesn't mean literally that he sees Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but he sees Allah's hand in everything. So as we're doing activism, whether it's organizing a Mina camp or going for a rally at an airport to oppose Trump's ban, right, on refugees and immigrants and others, we have to remember that God is the controller of history. We have to remember that nothing in the world is happening without God's hand. And this is really, really important. We can't get confused between cause and effect. We have to remember that if we spend our entire lives, and this is really anyone involved with any Islamic work, listen to this carefully. We make this mistake regularly. How many times have I heard someone say that the event was successful because 100 people showed up? Or the opposite. The event was not successful, nobody came. And you'll say, whoa, nobody came? You'll say, no, 3 people came. So wait, those 3 people are nobodies. Prophet Noah, alayhi salam, after 950 years, had a handful of followers. Would we say he's successful or a failure? Someone answer me during the chat. Would we say Noah, alayhi salam, Nuh, alayhi salam, was successful or a failure? After 950 years, he had a handful of followers. Some of his own family didn't follow him. What would we say? Yusuf, what do you think? Or whoever else is typing. Success or failure? Mustafa, what do you think? Yunus. Mustafa, Yunus, what do you think? Look, it's one thing to say the right answer, right? And his goal was to get followers, so I think it is success. His goal was to spread the deen. But here's the thing. His goal was to get followers to an extent, but his goal was not really to get followers. His goal was to invite people. So you're right. I get what you're saying. But listen to this carefully. On the day of judgment, there will be prophets. Every prophet will come with his ummah following them. There are some prophets that have no followers. Zero. Nobody will follow them. And the ummah of the Prophet ﷺ will have to testify that they still gave their message. Now imagine. Now we are saying that I think everybody, all 20 people listening to this would say, Nuh alayhi salam was successful. But we have to be honest for a second. Do we apply that same principle to our work? If you organize a camp and 10 people show up, would you say it's successful or a fail? You would say it didn't work. Most of us would. We have to stop thinking of activism in terms of quantitative results. Now, quantity is important, but we are people, listen to this, of quality over quantity. We are people of quality. There may be one person who shows up to a conference, and that is the next Malcolm X, and that person will reach millions of people. So we are not people who forget that Allah is in control And at the end of the day, our activism is not just about, oh, Mina was able to get increase from 3 camps to 10 camps. Okay, so we're doing 100 camps. Are we actually changing the world? Are we changing ourselves? Are we changing our hearts? Do we have pure intentions? It's not just about numbers. And sometimes our activism becomes too much about quantity and we have too little emphasis on quality. If you've heard 1,000 speeches in your life, you have to ask yourself, maybe I don't need to hear one more speech. Maybe I need to go pray. Maybe I need to go apply what I've learned. Maybe listening to speeches is not the point. I'm making the activism the point. One more speech, one more lecture, one more convention, one more camp. These are all good things if we understand that it's not just about quantity, it's about quality. And with this quote, we understand that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one who gives us results. So we're not obsessed with results. We're obsessed with pure intentions. And then we do the best we can. And this doesn't just apply to activism. Since we were young, we were programmed to be told that you earn your grades. The reality is you don't. We make good intentions, we work hard, and then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives us results. And we have to embrace an A or a C the same. But we have been brainwashed to think that we are defined by our grades and our jobs and our careers. The reality is, if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala doesn't want you to get an A, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala could test you with a B or a C or God forbid a D. And we have to know that if we did our best and we worked hard, results are from God in every way in our life. And this is what frees us. We're not obsessed with results, we're obsessed with intentions. And the last one we'll go through today, pure hearts sustain, impure hearts destroy. Pure hearts sustain, impure hearts destroy. I wrote this after studying a lot of social movements, from the Nation of Islam to the Black Panthers, now looking a little bit at Black Lives Matter. The reality is a lot of these great social movements, the civil rights movement, the movement towards women's voting rights, suffrage, and all of that. A lot of times these great movements, and even Muslim activism, a lot of times these great movements fall apart when egos get involved. From a local masjid board that acts like they're like the United Nations and everyone's their own country and they're fighting, to a MSA or a Mina where people get jealous of leaders and then they cause drama, to even, I mean, at every level. It happens in politics, this happens with social movements. If we don't purify our hearts, activism can destroy people and it can actually hurt the community. It becomes a game. When you start coveting leadership, or when I start coveting leadership, when you get jealous when someone gives a speech and they get a good result, when you don't get credit for something you did, and you subtly want to get credit, and and we sometimes act humble. Oh no, mashallah, mashallah. And if someone comes to us and says, "Amazing job, you're amazing," and you're like inside, you're like, "Yeah, I'm amazing," but outside we're like, "No, no, 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 it wasn't me." We have to know it's not about what we say to people; it's what we're feeling. And if we have pure hearts, and this is really what the Prophet ﷺ was preparing his companions for, a lot of the activism in Medina that happened, the external work of building a city, could not have happened. Even the battles like Badr and Uhud, it couldn't have happened if the companions didn't go through Makkah first. We have to have pure hearts if we're going to get out in the world. And this is not just for you, this is for all of us. That if we're not constantly purifying ourselves, that whatever is inside of us, we're going to overflow to the world. So we may think we're doing Islamic activism, but we're actually passing on our own diseases. Sins can be contagious. Sins are contagious diseases. And if we don't have purity, and we are just organizing camps and conferences, seminars, and going to speeches and just doing work, but we're not working on our inner world. The greatest highways that we need to drive down are inward. So if we're judging the world but not judging ourselves, if we're working outside but not working inside, if we're trying to activate the world but we're not activating our own heart, it will lead to imbalance. So as we're involved in doing great work, we have to be involved in purifying ourselves and having an inner life. And this is not part of one group or another. There's no label for this. This is Islam. This is for all Muslims. So those are the 5 points for today. Expel falsehood, affirm truth. This actually comes from La ilaha illallah. First, you have to expel all the false gods. Then you have to inhale Tawheed. That applies to activism also. Point 2 was path is not destination, means are not ends. Point 3, horizontal rebellion must be rooted in vertical conformity. Point 4, the profane see the windmill, the saints see the wind. we have to see God's role. As Cornel West said, there is a spiritual dimension to our crises. The world is not the way it is just because of politics. Palestine is not ruled by Israel just because of 1948 and 1967 and the AIPAC it's also because Muslims have fallen asleep. And we can't just blame others and not blame ourselves. If we are owning 90% of the liquor stores in inner cities, if we're occupying inner cities with alcohol, that liquor stores in inner cities are mostly run by Muslims and specifically from certain countries, then we can't just say, oh, we're being occupied abroad, because we are also occupiers. So we have to see ourselves in activism. And we have to realize that activism is not just about us, that Allah is really the one who changes the world. So if we, like Umar radiallahu anhu said, when the companions were facing a vast army, he said, I'm not afraid of that ocean. I'm afraid of the sins in our heart. Khalid bin Walid once turned to the army and he saw the Muslims were shaking. They were so scared. And he says, قُلْ لَا حَوْلَ وَلَا قُوَّةَ إِلَّا بِاللَّهِ. There's no power or strength except with Allah. So let's not forget the spiritual dimension to activism, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala could change the entire situation like this. So we are working, but we are the vessels and the servants of the real commander of the skies. And number 5, pure hearts sustain, impure hearts destroy. Activism will not work if the activists are trying to purify the world, but not purifying themselves. So those are the 5 principles. Inshallah, if we do this again, we'll do the next 5. Inshallah, everyone benefited. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. والعصر إن الإنسان لفي خسر إلا الذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات وتواصوا بالحق وتواصوا بالصبر. As I mentioned, I do the same workshop a little bit differently when I do it as a full version, where you guys actually get to explore the ideas a lot more. I think that helps. But inshallah, maybe we'll see you all. I just did this for Ohio State a few days ago, and if you ever want to teach this to your own community, even if I'm not able to come and join you all, I could also, if you email me, I have my email in the chat box. I could also do a training where I could teach some of you guys how to teach this workshop, because I think it's something that really needs to get out there for balance sake. Any questions now? We'll have about 5 minutes for questions. And I hope you guys enjoyed or benefited from something, inshallah. May Allah bless you too, MIC. Any questions, comments, reflections? Disagreements? That's okay too. I am safely far away, so you can say whatever you want. I won't cry. That's a good thing about video conferencing. You can just run away anytime you want. Anyone? Abdul Najib, Alina, Asia, Faria. I'm recognizing some of these names. Samad, Uzair, Omar. Anyone have any? Mustafa? Any comments, questions, ideas, reflections? Sami, Ibrahim. If anybody has any, we'll take it. I'll give you guys about a minute to write them out. If not, then we'll conclude. And please pray for the Atlanta Falcons today. What is the difference between purity and being free from imperfection? So we know that only the prophets are completely perfect. It's a spectrum where we are trying to purify ourselves, right? Knowing that we'll never reach the level of the angels or the level of the prophets, but it's a spectrum. So we are working towards purity. So when we say pure heart sustained, it doesn't mean that this person doesn't have any inclination everybody has a moment where they could have inclinations, but they're on the journey of purification, right? So we have to have the intention of purifying ourselves as we work to purify the world. Samad, exactly. Falcons all the way. Any other questions? Part of that is just being introspective. It's very, very easy to see faults in others. It's very challenging to see faults in ourselves, right? And we have to be gentle. I mean, it's not like we have to be really harsh with ourselves all the time, but we have to be introspective. If we're critiquing someone for being a dictator, like a president of the United States, no names will be mentioned, we have to make sure that we're not being dictators in our own lives. We're not the people like, you can have someone that's a dictator at home with their family. They act like Abu Bakr in the masjid and they act like Abu Jahl at home. They dress like Moses, but they act like Pharaoh, right? Omar Hussein, we're gonna forgive you for that. We're gonna forgive you for that. We're gonna forgive you for that comment, Omar Hussein. Patriots, really? Anyways, I'm a Colts fan. I'm from Indiana, so I can't never go for the Patriots. Okay, any other questions, comments? I think Sana is writing something. We'll wait for her. What if they are doing a lot of wrong? Could they still make more of a difference than someone better? No, you look. The idea is that you could be making mistakes and still your purification may be in service. The idea is not that we don't do any good until we're completely purified. But you have to make sure that you're not taking your sins and spreading it. So, like for example, if you have an issue that you have to deal with, and if you get involved with activism, like you have an issue of arrogance, and activism makes you more arrogant, you just have to be careful. But you could be someone that has a lot of sins and mistakes, like we all do, and you are at the soup kitchen working every day, and that is your purification. That's how you find God. An example of that is the prostitute. We know that lady that she was actually a prostitute and she fed water to a thirsty dog, and that was the reason she went to Jannah. So she was doing a lot of wrong things, but her activism, her service, was her purification, and that's a good thing. Her activism didn't make her worse; it actually purified her. Make sense? Okay. Any other questions, comments? Okay. If not, I'm going to pass that along to Brother Noman. And I want to thank Brother Noman Hussein for facilitating all of this, alhamdulillah. And thank you, Ibrahim. Thank you for your question. Wa yakum for you. Hope everything's going well with you.
Okay, so assalamu alaikum everyone. I think if we don't have any more questions, we can go ahead and wrap up. Again, Brother Saad, Jazakallah so much for coming and giving the halaqah. And again, if you guys have any other questions, he did put his email in chat box, so I'm sure he'd be okay with you going ahead and emailing him if you have any other questions. And with that, inshallah, please look out on social media um, for our the next halaqah, inshallah. And everybody have fun at the Super Bowl. I myself don't know much about that. I legit thought it was a basketball thing until a few years ago. So, okay, inshallah, we can wrap up. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.